Statement by the First Minister on coronavirus.
Diolch Dipyn Lywydd, mae Cymru yn wynebu
Wales is
mwyaf difrifol ers ganrif. Mae'n rhaid i ni weithredu mwyn gwarchod ein cymunedau, amddiffyn y gwasanaeth iechyd ac achubu bywydau. Mae'r camau rydyn wedi cymryd yn barod yn gwneud gwahaniaeth, ond mae'n rhaid i ni wneud mwy. Felly,
Translation's not working. Sorry, First Minister, the translation wasn't working then.
Testing, 1, 2. Is that coming through at all now? 1, 2, testing.
It is now. It is. Sorry.
I'll begin.
Yeah, thank you.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Wales is facing the worst medical crisis for over a century. We must act to safeguard our communities, protect the health service and save lives. The steps that we've already taken are making a difference, but we must do more. And therefore, yesterday, the 4 governments of the United Kingdom agreed to introduce serious new measures, and these are necessary to slow the spread of the virus and defend particularly the most vulnerable people. We must all change our way of life. Every part of society has to respond for the benefit of all. Welsh Government is totally focused on this challenge. We will persevere in working closely with our partners to respond to the crisis and to protect the people of Wales.
Since I last answered questions in the Senedd, and many of those questions were about coronavirus. In the course of the last 7 days, the scientific advice has been clear. The pace of the spread of the virus has accelerated considerably across the United Kingdom. Today, I have to report that there have been 16 deaths of people diagnosed with coronavirus in Wales and more than 400 cases confirmed. These figures are rising every day and will continue to rise over the days and weeks to come. Coronavirus is a virus which is easily transmissible and against which we have little natural protection. For most people, it will be a mild illness, but as we know, and as the figures I've just outlined show, some groups of people are more at risk of developing a serious and even fatal illness if they are exposed. The demand on our NHS services is already significant and could become overwhelming. That is why we are all being asked to take a series of unprecedented steps to change the way we live our lives, because that is the best chance we have to slow the spread of the virus. And slowing the speed allows us to protect our NHS and to save lives. Now, throughout this period, COBRA has met regularly and has taken advice from the 4 UK Chief Medical Officers and from the Scientific Group for Emergencies. As that advice has evolved, we have progressively tightened the measures we need to take. Since the Senedd last met, we have closed schools, closed down pubs, clubs, bars and restaurants. Yesterday, the Welsh Government took measures to close down caravan parks, campsites, tourist hotspots and beauty spots to reinforce the guidance about people not gathering in large numbers and keeping their distance. We also announced the strict enforcement by local authorities of the closure of pubs and bars, with the risk of licensees losing their licence if caught flouting the ban. A few hours later, at the end of yesterday afternoon, COBRA met again to consider even stricter measures. As you will have seen from the statements which I, the Prime Minister, and the First Ministers of Scotland and Northern Ireland issued, what was previously advice is now a requirement. For the next 3 weeks at least, all high street shops and community spaces will be closed. Food shops, local NHS services, pharmacies, banks and post offices and petrol stations will continue to be open, but all gatherings of more than 2 people in public will not be permitted. We must stay at home, leaving only for strictly limited reasons. And the 4 reasons are these. Firstly, shopping for basic necessities, for example, food and medicines. But these trips need to be as infrequent as we can make them. Secondly, we are allowed 1 form of exercise each day. For example, a run, a walk, or a cycle alone or with members of your household. Thirdly, we are allowed to leave home for any medical need or to provide care or to help a vulnerable person. And finally, we can travel to and from work, but only where this absolutely cannot be done from home. Now, these are extraordinary measures, but as I've said, they are necessary to reduce the spread of coronavirus and to allow the NHS to save lives. As we all follow these new rules, they will reduce our day-to-day contact with other people and the speed and transmission of the virus. These are rules for everybody. Not one of us is an exception. All of our lives have changed, and that includes the way in which this Senedd will work. The measures I have outlined here came into force at midnight last night. They will last for 3 weeks when they will be reviewed. The UK government will provide the police with the powers necessary to enforce these measures, but of course, I hope very much that we do not reach that point. Responding to this pandemic is the work of the entire Welsh Government. Last night, the Education Minister provided additional guidance to parents and schools in light of these new requirements. The Economy Minister has set out advice for businesses, and the Environment Minister is having daily discussions with the food and farming industries. The whole Cabinet is focused on the public health emergency in front of us. Today, ministers would have provided oral statements here about the work they are undertaking, and we will ensure, of course, that those statements are available to members here and to the public. The way in which the Welsh Government is able to work so closely with our partners in local government, with the trades unions, with the voluntary sector, with employers and businesses, is fundamental to the way we are responding to this pandemic, and I believe a real strength of the way we are able to do things here in Wales. Can I close by thanking everyone for their help and for their support as we face this public health emergency together. This is a very worrying time for families and communities throughout our country. And I know that there will be many, many questions that people have, especially following last night's announcement, and we will try our best to respond to them all. We have asked a great deal of the public, but particularly of our health and social care staff, of our public services, and those many people who have come forward to volunteer. The response in Wales has been genuinely outstanding. And to all of those, I say again, thank you so much. Diolch o galon I chi gyd.
Thank you. Paul Davis.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank you, First Minister, for your statement this morning. And can I also thank you for the regular briefings you've given me over the last few weeks during this unprecedented time. As I've said before, we must put our political differences aside so that we work together to tackle this virus. Can I also take this opportunity to thank everyone who is helping to keep us safe during this crisis and to remind people to stay at home in order to save lives and to protect our NHS. As the threat of the coronavirus continues to grow, it's absolutely essential that the Welsh Government now reprioritises its finances urgently to ensure that its resources are spent effectively during the course of this outbreak. Can you therefore confirm, First Minister, that the Welsh Government is urgently reprioritising its finances? And perhaps I can even suggest that you consider publishing an emergency budget going forward so that the government's finances can be refocused on essential services, because, as you're aware, over the weekend a number of local authorities have requested additional financial support to tackle this virus. Now, as the spread of the virus continues to develop, it's critical that all funding is made available to organisations and schemes that are supporting individuals and businesses affected by the outbreak. Therefore, I hope the Welsh Government will be looking at the funding allocations that it gives to third sector organisations, and where it needs to, it diverts funding away from organisations that aren't at the front line of delivering key services at this particular time, because this will show that the Welsh Government has appropriately targeted every penny it can to supporting those affected by COVID-19, rather than continuing to fund schemes which are not in the immediate public interest. And can you therefore confirm, First Minister, that each Welsh Government Minister will urgently assess their funding streams and divert all available resources to tackling the coronavirus outbreak and its impact on Wales? And can you also tell us that any funding distributed to third sector organisations will only be distributed to those delivering key services at this time? Now, at this time, it's vital that the Welsh Government does everything in its power to support those people who are working to combat the coronavirus, including ensuring that they have access to essential goods and services such as childcare. Now, last Thursday, the UK Government provided comprehensive guidance on who our key workers are, and the Welsh Government also issued a letter to schools asking that they identify children of people involved in the immediate response to the coronavirus outbreak. However, I understand that some local authorities have ignored this and instead chosen to limit its school provision to those in health, social care and emergency services, contrary to the guidance issued. Therefore, do you share my view, First Minister, that we need as much support as possible for all those working with us to combat COVID-19, and that we need to ensure there's clarity in the messages issued to the public? And under those circumstances, what discussions has the Welsh Government had with local authorities and school leaders about ensuring that they are providing school and childcare provision to those working to tackling the outbreak and support those affected by coronavirus? And can you also tell us what planning the Welsh Government has done on how key workers can be supported over the medium and longer term, so that they can be confident that provision will continue to be made available whilst they work to tackle the virus and support those that are affected? Now, of course, as you've just said, First Minister, these are unprecedented times, and we should all be very grateful to the hard-working NHS staff who are at the front line, doing all that they can to ensure that patients get the help, treatment and the support that they need. And it's extremely vital that those staff are also taking every precaution possible to keep themselves safe. And where we can, we must look into recruiting professionals in order to ensure that continuity of service continues. And I'm pleased that many health professionals have now answered the calls to return to support the NHS during this crisis. In the circumstances, First Minister, what immediate action is the Welsh Government taking to ensure that these retired health professionals, and indeed those that have left for other careers and are now returning, are able to return as quickly and as efficiently as possible? Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that pharmacies will also play a very important role in the coming weeks to support communities, and I'd be grateful if you would tell us what assessment has the Welsh Government given to the role of community pharmacists at this time, and how their expert advice can be utilised, and what discussions have taken place with local health boards to, for example, relax rules around issues such as issuing prescriptions, and in particular repeat prescriptions for those that are now unable to physically attend a surgery to pick up their prescriptions. Now, thousands of businesses across Wales are understandably anxious about the impact that the virus currently has on their business and may continue to have on their business. Of course, we've all received correspondence from businesses and the self-employed who tell us that they're struggling to better understand how the Welsh Government can help their business and, crucially, how to access that support as quickly as possible. So can you tell us what monitoring is the Welsh Government undertaking of the work of Business Wales to ensure that it's getting the right support to businesses in Wales in a timely manner? And what specific support is being made available to those businesses that don't currently pay business rates but still need support to keep their businesses afloat? Now, I asked you last week about food supplies and shortages, and as the virus continues to spread, there is a knock-on effect on the ability to get essential supplies to those that need them. I understand that the Welsh Government was meeting last week with third sector representatives and local authorities to discuss how best to get supplies to those most vulnerable, but there still are some very valid concerns amongst local charities across Wales who are supporting communities in getting food supplies to people. So could you tell us, therefore, what new measures the Welsh Government is taking to ensure that the most vulnerable in our communities are receiving the supplies that they actually need? And what discussions have government ministers had with retailers about the role that they could play in supplying essential supplies to local charities and community organisations? So with that, Deputy Presiding Officer, can I once again thank the First Minister for his statement this morning, and I look forward to receiving further updates from him and indeed from the Welsh Government in the coming days and in the coming weeks.
Thank you. First Minister.
Diolch, Deputy Lewin, and thank the Leader of the Opposition for those questions. Entirely agree with the initial points he made, and governments of very different political persuasions across the United Kingdom are working very closely together on a daily basis on a common task. As far as finances are concerned, our current intention is to bring forward a supplementary budget to realign Welsh Government budgets with the new and urgent priorities. We are doing exactly what Paul Davies suggested in interrogating every budget that every minister holds to see what might be able to be released from plans that were previously in place in order to be able to fund new and more urgent priorities. The Finance Minister will meet every portfolio minister tomorrow in order to hear from them how much money they are able to release to make sure that that is being done in the most rigorous way possible, because we have two priorities and two priorities only, Dipra Lywydd. One is to support our essential public services in the efforts they will be making, and the secondly is to support businesses and people in employment, so that when people emerge from the other side of coronaviruses, they still have futures, jobs to go to, and a prospect in front of them. We are working closely with the third sector, of course, and they themselves are reprioritising their budgets. Very grateful to the WCVA, which has dug into its own reserves so that it can put money up immediately to be able to assist third sector organisations to do the extra things that they are keen and able to do. We work very closely with local authorities, as Paul Davies suggested, in daily contact with key local authority leaders. There was anxiety over the weekend, Dipra Lywydd, that the number of parents who would bring children to the new provision on Monday would exceed the 20% of children that is the maximum we can allow into those facilities. Otherwise, the epidemiological advantage of taking that course of action would be dissipated. And there were some local authorities that decided to take a precautionary approach at the start of the week to make sure that that didn't happen. In practice, those difficulties didn't arise. The numbers were at the lower end of what might have been anticipated yesterday. And I know that those local authorities will now be recalibrating their plans. And we will be working with those local authorities so that we have medium-term arrangements in place so key workers know not just how they will get through the next couple of weeks, but how they will manage beyond Easter as well. Dipra Lywydd, I'm going, I'm sure members will understand, to leave health questions largely to my colleagues so I can respond to as many other questions as possible. But just to give Paul Davies an assurance that the bill that we will debate later for LCM purposes does provide the Welsh Government with new ability to accelerate the return to the workplace of retired health and indeed social care professionals as well. We have worked very closely with the UK Government in relation to business support, and we are, of course, monitoring the demands on Business Wales, and they have gone up exponentially over last week, as you can imagine. The number of calls to the helpline, the number of visits to the website way beyond what would normally be anticipated, and we have had to move 21 additional staff to the helpline to be able to deal with the volume of calls, and the number of calls and our ability to respond to them are monitored every day. Finally, in relation to the food business matters that Paul Davies raised, letters are starting to go out today to those people in the group who need to be shielded from the impact of coronavirus by staying in their homes, not for 3 weeks, but for up to 3 months. And that's a smaller subset of the Welsh population. And those letters will provide people with advice, firstly on why their medical condition requires them to take that course of action, but also the sources of support that will be available to them while they are isolated in that way. And that includes assistance from the food retailers as well. Can I just end by saying this, and it picks up a point that Paul Davies made about pharmacies as well. I entirely understand the enormous pressures that everybody feels, that people are under pressure and that they act sometimes in response to that pressure. But there is no excuse at all for people visiting a community pharmacy or a food retailer to take that frustration out on frontline people who are there to help them. And we have seen some examples. They're isolated examples, and we don't want to exaggerate them at all, but we have seen examples of that, and they really are not acceptable. And even in these most difficult of times, we will not accept them here in Wales.
Thank you. Sian Gwenllyn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The measures announced yesterday are without precedent, but are crucial if we are to prevent the further spread of coronavirus. Any steps that will ensure that there is no additional pressure on our health service are to be welcomed in this time of crisis. This is not a national holiday, it is a national crisis, and each and every one of us has a responsibility to comply with these new measures for the benefit of ourselves and for those around us. May I turn now to the important questions that do arise. First of all, the new guidance published yesterday stating that people should not travel unless it is to carry out essential work or when it is not possible to work from home. This therefore means that many people working freelance will continue to travel and to work, likewise those in the building profession, mechanics, and dozens of other professions. I do think that we need clarity on this issue, and certainly we need clarity as a matter of urgency on the construction industry. As we speak, I see pictures of queues forming outside companies selling building materials both to the public and to the construction industry. Builders are turning up to work today because they can't do that kind of work from home. Of course they can't. Many of the construction companies will be unwilling to send their workforce home unless there is an order from government to close down these sites. Now, in having that direction in place, they would then qualify for government assistance, which would pay 80% of the workforce salaries. Now, for example, there could be an order to close a canteen on a building site, which to all intents and purposes would mean that the site would have to be closed too. In a sector where health and safety is a priority, these workers will be working close together, and it's totally unacceptable to ask these people to put their health at risk and their colleagues' health at risk. So I'd be very grateful if you could provide some clarity on those points. In the First Minister's statement, there was no mention at all to additional support for the self-employed, freelance workers and those on zero-hour contracts. Now, in the absence of any further detail, will you, as a government, as the Welsh Government, commit to pay a basic income to workers in these categories? This is the principal thing to do, and in implementing it, you will receive our full support. I support your statement of yesterday, which meant that caravan sites would have to close as well as tourist attractions. What steps are in place to ensure that people do comply with that direction not to travel? In turning now to another concern that's been raised with me by a number of people over the past few days, the fact that NHS workers and even more people working in the care and the community sector don't have the necessary equipment that they need to safeguard them personally and to safeguard those that they care for. This is a cause of huge concern and it's unacceptable. When will you have an assurance that everyone will be able to access appropriate equipment? And have you looked at the possibility of using military equipment for this work? Now, in turning to education, forgive me, I do know that it isn't specifically your responsibility, but there are questions arising here too. If I could start with children receipt of free school meals, you have said that they will continue to receive food, but how? And that can vary from school to school, according to my understanding of the situation. Do you agree with me that giving vouchers to be spent in local shops is the fairest way of acting in terms of dealing with the stigma of children having to get packed lunches from schools, and vouchers would also reduce unnecessary travel? You say in the guidance provided by the Education Department that if one parent is a critical worker but the other is not, then the parent who is not in the critical category should provide other home care wherever possible, and it's those words, wherever possible. What does that mean? This is creating some confusion for people. And in terms of learning, pupils, of course, want to continue to learn during this time. There is much activity that can happen online, and we are very grateful to the teachers providing that material. But of course, not every child and not every pupil will have their own laptop. They often have to share. If it had happened at my house with 4 children and myself all working from home, then it would have been very difficult for everyone to get by using just the one laptop. And not every home has broadband, of course. Not every home has an internet connection. So do you agree with Plaid Cymru that every child that doesn't have a laptop should be given one, and every home should have a connection to the internet? And will you work with Openreach to deal with the problem of slow broadband in rural areas. There are some children who can't get online at all because of problems with broadband. And there is a specific concern about the early years sector and childcare sectors. Can you guarantee that financial support will remain in place for all sorts of providers? We do need some clarity on that. It will be a time of getting used to some very far-reaching changes to our daily lives. For many, it's also a period of financial uncertainty, but for each and every one of us, we do need to ensure that we deal with the virus and prevent its spread, and we will work constructively with you in that great effort.
Well, Deputy Presiding Officer, thank you very much to Sian Gwenlly and for those questions and for the manner in which she and other people in her party have collaborated constructively with us over this period of crisis. And I completely agree with her that this is the message that it's important for us to convey to people. When people are not in work, it's not a bank holiday. We are facing a public health crisis, and it's important that people respond to the crisis in their approach to their everyday tasks in their lives. Sian had a number of questions. As regards self-employed people, we expect to receive something from the United Kingdom government. We're not sure whether we will hear today or sometime during this week, but that's up to them. We have no funding. And Paul Davis alluded to the demand on the funding that we already hold, and for the important services there isn't sufficient funding in our budget to put extra funding in place. So we are looking to the United Kingdom government, and we have heard from them, and they are working hard at the Treasury to plan for greater help and support for people in that situation. What I was saying yesterday about the caravans and in the regulations that I signed off at 9:30 approximately last night, contained in those regulations, there are measures in place, measures and powers for the local authorities to collaborate with the police to cope with the new situation. We have worked closely with people within the sector too, and they are eager to pursue what we have said and to collaborate and cooperate with us. Vaughan Gething will be able to respond on the PPE, but just to say, Deputy Presiding Officer, I have given the civil servants the powers or the authority to approach the Ministry of Defence officially and to set up a new agreement or contract between ourselves and the Army here in Wales to receive the assistance and support that they can give and that they are willing to give. Support in the planning field. They can help us greatly with logistics, as they call it, but also with people. In the field of education, the best way for us to deal with the free school meals is to give families money through the child benefit system, the universal benefit.
All children, certainly all children who will be entitled to free school meals. I understand vouchers may well have a place to play, but my preferred option is that those families just get money so that they can put food in front of their children while the school system is not operating normally. We put all of that to the UK government yesterday. In the meantime, we're making and mending for now to try and make sure that where vouchers are the right answer, we can do that to support local economies in the way that Sian suggested, and where that isn't possible, to make sure that there is at least food that children can pick up. And even under the new, very strict arrangements that are being put in place as from today, in Wales, children will still be allowed to go to school and collect food, if that is the arrangement that is in place there. As far as the points that Sian made, of course, teachers are working very hard to make sure that there are online resources, but that will not be sufficient for everybody, and I know that there are plans, Education Minister working with the sector, to find other ways in which those young people for whom that is not a viable way of maintaining their education, that there are other ways in which they can be assisted too. And
in the rental sector, just to say, we're taking the powers in the bill that comes before the Senate today to assist people in the private rental sector. We now have an agreement with the public sector, with the housing associations and the local authorities too, to assist people over the ensuing period, and we announced last Friday an additional £10 million to help local authorities with services for the homeless, and there's more that we want to do as well.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And First Minister, can I firstly put on record my thanks to all of our key workers that are keeping our emergency and frontline services going, but also to put on record my thanks to you and to your ministers for the way in which you've been handling this unprecedented situation that the country finds itself in. The regular updates and information, together with tailoring to the specific needs of Wales, has been very welcome and has helped me in advising my constituents in what has been a very worrying and distressing time for many people. And can I also say that you have my full support for the additional measures announced last night, which are a matter of national necessity at present. Now, a number of questions have already been put to you and have been dealt with. However, I wanted to raise two specific issues with you. Firstly, in terms of personal safety, I'm sure that I'm not alone in being alarmed and continuing to be alarmed, should I say, at the behaviour of people in supermarkets across the country. Now, from where I live in Merthyr, I can see the big Tesco superstore, and I see every morning huge crowds going into that supermarket, coming out with trolleys full of goods that, in all honesty, they're never going to be able to use in just the space of a few days. And apart from the antisocial behaviour of stockpiling, which deprives other people of essential goods at a time when there should be no shortage, my main concern is the threat to public safety that people shopping in such numbers causes. Now, as I understand it from friends that I have living in France, this isn't happening there. In France, only one person per trolley is allowed into the store. Everyone who comes into the store is offered hand sanitizer as they enter and they leave. There are one-way systems in operation and clearly marked distancing in the stores. People are not attending in hordes, they're not stockpiling and panic buying, and no one is going short. So my question is there something that we can learn from how they are managing this in France? And are we now at a stage where some kind of restriction needs to be placed, both to support public safety, but also to ensure that everyone can get their fair share of essential goods? Secondly, I had, this is an education matter, First Minister, so you may not be able to answer this, but I had a very distressed constituent contact me to say that as she's now on 0 hours contract and currently has no work, she's applied for universal credit, but as we know, she'll have to wait a number of weeks before that comes through. In the meantime, she has 2 children at school who up till now have not qualified, because she has been earning until this point, have not qualified and not been eligible for free school meals. So while she can now apply to get them free school meals because of her changed circumstances, the process takes time. And the local authority, whilst they're not unsympathetic and know that the Welsh Government will provide additional money to deal with the current free school meals arrangements, are uncertain about whether additional money will come through for adding further emergency free school meals to their numbers. So my questions are, do we know what arrangements DWP are putting in place to speed up universal credit payments so that people in my constituent don't have to wait the 5 weeks for money due to them in this situation? And will additional money be made available to local authorities to allow them to both fast-track free school meals applicants and also to pay for the additional meals that would need to be made available?
Thank Dawn Bowden for those questions. Thank you for what she said at the start about the flow of information from the Welsh Government. The Welsh Government is in no different position than any other organisation. We have significant numbers of people not in work because of illness or self-isolation, and we are instituting a very strict work-from-home policy. So sometimes the work of getting that information out falls on very few shoulders, and people are working very hard. And I know that sometimes we're having to work even harder to catch up because of the rapidly moving position, but grateful to Dawn for what she said about the usefulness of that. In relation to supermarkets and safety, I'm certain there are things we can learn from other places. Supermarkets are recruiting additional security staff. Some supermarkets have already instituted a one-way system around the store. We talked yesterday with other UK governments about measures that we might be able to put in place, and there are powers that we could use in Wales if the position demanded it. £1 billion worth of food beyond the normal sale disappeared off shelves across the United Kingdom last week and are now sitting in people's larders. And the advice to people must be to start eating it, because there is no need to go on adding to it. The sector is absolutely clear. There is enough food in the system. The problem is not the supply. The problem is in the way in which people, understandably, I'm not being critical of people, the way in which people have responded to the anxiety that they feel. But if people are able to get on a more even keel, supermarkets able to do the things they say that they can do, then so far we believe that the position can be stabilised and people do not need to worry about there being insufficient food in the system. It is there. As to universal credit, the DWP, I know, have been very badly affected by people self-isolating and people being unwell. They have a huge increase in the number of people who are out of work and needing to make claims, and fewer people to respond to them. We were told by the Secretary of State at the DWP yesterday that they are working to strip out some of the complexity in the system to make it easier and quicker. I make an appeal again to the UK Government to abandon the 5-week waiting period for universal credit. That is the single biggest barrier that people face. The fact that even when you do manage to fight your way through the system, you still have to wait 5 weeks, and people in the current emergency are just not in a position to do that. So I say again, as I said yesterday to the Secretary of State, please change that rule. As to free school meals, the Welsh Government announced £7 million in additional funding for local authorities on Friday to help them deal with the increased number of students coming through the door with free school meals. Let me be clear with local authorities. Free school meals are an entitlement. If a child meets the rules, the child gets a free school meal, and there is no rationing ability that local authorities have to choose between children in that position. So I understand the anxieties, of course, of local authorities faced with bills that they worry about how they might pay. That's why we announced the £7 million extra. But the child is the most important thing in that equation, and if a child is now entitled to a free school meal where they weren't until recently, we must make sure that they get it.
Thank you. Caroline Jones.
Thank you for your statement, First Minister, and also for the briefings that you've given me.
I would also like to offer my condolences to the family and friends of those who have lost the battle to this dreadful disease. I want to give thanks on behalf of myself and my party to all of those putting their lives at risk to protect us from the coronavirus pandemic. Who would have thought just a few weeks ago that we would be facing this terrible threat to life and placing our entire society on hold? It took a couple of months for this new coronavirus to infect 100,000 people, and a couple of weeks to infect the next 100,000 people, and a couple of days to spread to the next 100,000. We don't know an awful lot about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but we do know that it's highly infectious and very deadly, and far more deadly than seasonal flu, which kills nearly 500 million people worldwide each year. And we have a vaccine for flu. At this moment in time, we have no available treatments or vaccines for coronavirus, which is why I'm astounded that people continue to ignore all the warnings and all the medical advice. So unless we stop the spread, COVID-19 could kill tens of thousands of people in Wales. First Minister, the advice from all 4 governments is to stay at home and only leave infrequently to shop for essential items, to fulfil any medical or care needs, or to travel to work where absolutely necessary. First Minister, there is a lot of confusion surrounding essential work. The guidance around retail, leisure and hospitality has to be very clear, but there is much more confusion from other sectors. I have constituents who are glaziers, for example, insurance claim assessors and people working in call centres, all confused about whether they should go to work. So can the Welsh Government give clear guidances in Wales as to what is considered essential work? It's not hyperbole to say that lives depend upon us all doing the right thing, and unless we take decisive action now, this pandemic could really get out of hand, and we will all lose loved ones and people we know to this invisible killer. We also place tremendous strain on those on the front line of the battle to control coronavirus, our NHS staff, the doctors, nurses and those working around the clock to save those in acute respiratory distress. People need to understand that COVID-19 is not like flu, and while people shouldn't panic, they should be made more aware and with graphic details of the seriousness of the disease. And they need to do as instructed. Stay at home if you can and stay away from other people. We all need to do our part to relieve the burden on those at the forefront of the battle against coronavirus. First Minister, what more can we do to assist doctors and nurses, aside from all of us adhering to the advice? Shouldn't we be ensuring that all frontline staff receive deliveries of food and other essentials so that they don't have to battle at supermarkets after spending 24 to 48 hours battling coronavirus? We quite rightly heap praise on our health and social care workforce for their actions to keep us safe during this public health emergency. But we must also thank the shop workers, the delivery drivers and a whole host of businesses that are also ensuring we all continue to have access to the essentials of life. But we mustn't forget your officials and those across government who are working around the clock to put the support measures in place. So thank you for this. Policy is having to be devised on the hoof as we react to a constantly shifting situation. And it's easy to criticise, but policies are made under such circumstances are bound to have issues. We can't avoid cracks. We just have to ensure that no one or no business falls between them. And I am constantly inundated with calls from business owners regarding their future and the financial predicament they find themselves in, which we know is unprecedented, but it is important to ease their minds regarding this. I welcome the decision to refund seasonal ticket holders impacted by the virus outbreak and the news that NHS staff are to receive free travel on public transport. However, as services are reduced, particularly on trains, the services are becoming more crowded, putting people at greater danger of contracting COVID-19. So, First Minister, will you ensure that Transport for Wales train services have additional carriages to allow enough space for social distancing, particularly if NHS staff are to continue using these services? Unfortunately, not all staff are able to work from home, so while the demand on public transport can be reduced, it can't be totally eliminated. Up until a few weeks ago, we were actively encouraging people to leave their cars and catch the train or the bus. Now government advice is to avoid public transport. First Minister, what additional steps can you take to ensure the safety of those who have no choice but to rely upon public transport? Services have been reduced across Wales, but surely we should be doing whatever we can to reduce overcrowding, even if that means more services. With large sectors of the Welsh economy quite rightly put on hold while we fight this virus, this leaves many facilities and segments of the workforce on hiatus. What consideration has the Welsh Government given to finding alternative uses for these sectors to aid in the fight against coronavirus? For example, will you be encouraging brewers to switch production to alcohol gel? And will government be removing any tax liabilities for such a move? Have you considered the role of the hospitality sector can play in supporting key workers? And I also echo the First Minister's request regarding the 5-week wait for universal credit. Thank you once again, First Minister. If we all work together whilst maintaining a healthy distance, we can beat this disease and return to life as normal in the not too distant future. Thank you.
First Minister. Thank Karen Jones for that. I thought she made an important point in the beginning about just how quickly our lives have been changed in a very few weeks, and it's not surprising that many of our fellow citizens find themselves confused as a result, and I know that huge numbers of them come to their members of the Senedd looking for answers. If I could ask members just one thing, it would be to go to the advice that we have published already to see if the answers are there. If the answers aren't there, then of course members should contact the relevant minister and ask for further advice. But because we are putting up advice all the time, I think it's quite likely that some of those questions will already have answers, and they just need exploring so that people can get the best information. I want to say again, most people will experience a very mild episode of this illness. The problem is that while you are symptomatic, you could be passing the virus on to somebody who is much more vulnerable. So the reason why we are asking people to stay home is not because we think that lots and lots of people will be very seriously ill, but it's because by staying at home, you don't pose that risk to others, and we can slow the curve of the disease. There are many examples of organisations across Wales offering help, both with health workers, but in the social care sector as well. Can I commend those many members of the hospitality sector who've offered accommodation for key workers so they don't have to travel distances home but can stay near their place of work, or who contact the government to say, we're really used to serving food. We know what it's like to look after people. We would be willing to put those skills and capacities at the service of social care providers in this locality to help them if their staff aren't available. And we're doing our best to be a broker between those offers and the people we know who need it. Can I say that Karen Jones made some very important points about transport. And we're in continued discussion with Transport for Wales about getting the balance right. And I discussed this yesterday with the Mayor of London, where similar issues are faced in relation to tube overcrowding. Tube services are down to half of what they normally would be, and that is having the effect of drawing people close together in the tubes that are running. And we are trying to learn lessons together across the United Kingdom in constant discussion with Transport for Wales and bus operators. We're trying to strike the right balance Bus numbers and train numbers are down in terms of passengers. But nevertheless, we need sufficient services so people aren't forced to be in too close proximity with others because they're having to use that reduced level of service.
Thank you. You can see that the clock is in the red zone, but I will extend this. However, can I just make a gentle plea? We've had the four main speakers from the four parties here. Can I make a plea that if your question has been raised, could you not raise it? And can you seek to be, I will extend, as I say, but can you seek to be brief? So please, no long speeches before you ask your questions. Then there is an opportunity for the statement from the Minister for Health and Social Services afterwards, as the First Minister said. If it's health related, could you wait? And I'll make sure that I do my best to call you in that one. So, and I believe that I will extend, as I say, I will extend this, but the First Minister does have other things that are more, that he will have to go away and seek to do. So with that gentle health warning, Alan Davis.
That was very kind, Deputy Presiding Officer. First Minister, I think many of us wish to echo the thanks that have been extended across the chamber this morning to all those people who work within the National Health Service and in other parts of the public sector, ensuring that we are all safe and our families are kept safe, and also to yourself and your team of ministers and officials who have been working hard to ensure that those public service workers do have the resources that they need to do their job. In terms of delivering this policy, we need a number of different things to be in place. We need the law to be in place and in the right place, and we'll be doing that later today. We need the resources to be available to people, and I know that ministers are making great efforts to ensure that that happens. But we also need people to feel that they are able to both protect their family by ensuring they do follow the instructions and the advice from government, but they're also able to afford to do that. I've received a number of correspondence over the last few days from constituents who are being told by their managers and bosses that they must go to work, that their work is essential, whatever it happens to be. There needs to be clarity for people to feel able to say to their employers that they don't feel that they're able to do so. And we need to ensure that employers who do behave like this towards their workforce are told very, very clearly that that is no longer acceptable. So we do need, I think, a very clear analysis of what is essential and what isn't essential. Members have already raised the issues of self-employed people. There are a number of self-employed people in my constituency in Blaenau Gwent who are terrified over the prospect of the next few weeks and losing all their income. We need to be able to ensure that self-employed people are protected in the same way as people who have employment. I've also been contacted by many supply teachers who are concerned about the situation that they are facing with the closure of schools. In the same way, First Minister, many social enterprises, of course, are not covered by the support being given to business. And many social enterprises in my own constituency, whether it's social enterprises who provide services to constituents, or social enterprises such as working men's clubs and community centres, are facing very real difficulties. And I'd be grateful if you could outline how the Welsh Government can provide support for those people, for those charities and third sector organisations at this time. You have already this morning answered questions on support for local government, and I think there was a very warm welcome throughout the country for the £7 million that was given to ensure that there is sufficient funding for free school meals. And many of us will repeat the words that you used earlier. The free school meals is an entitlement, and it is something which all children who qualify should be able to access. But there are also issues about the resources that local government have. My own local authority has said that they do have difficulties getting access to sufficient personal protection equipment, and that is something which I think concerns all of us. But all local authorities, of course, could be helped out if a government were to take certain measures, such as bringing forward the RSG payments to ensure that there is less reliance on council tax income immediately at a time when many people might be finding difficulties with that, and also to have a council tax reduction scheme whereby people who have lost their incomes over the coming months will be able to feel protected in some way, so that there is a range of support available to local government to enable them to respond to the challenges they face. And of course, some of the most vulnerable people will be reached by local government. And it is one of the things that terrifies me that we have said to a lot of vulnerable groups, whether they be over 70s or people with long-standing or underlying health conditions, that they should stay at home. That is difficult, of course, if they can't get access to food via supermarket deliveries, or whether the supermarkets, in the same way as Dawn Bowden's already outlined, are where there is the biggest congregation and gathering of people today. There needs to be action urgently taken to address the issue around supermarkets at the moment. And in terms of access to information, you responded to this earlier. I am seriously concerned about the ability of the BBC and other broadcasters to communicate effectively what is happening throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. I've listened to a number of different broadcasts where the BBC in particular has broadcast information that is wholly and completely inaccurate because it is simply focusing on England and not on the United Kingdom as a whole. This is a matter which the current Director General assured me when I was a Minister with responsibility for broadcasting policy that would be addressed. He hasn't addressed it, and he's failed to address it. And that is something which in this emergency is becoming something of a crisis. Finally, and to test your patience, Deputy Presiding Officer, I have received a question from Jenny Rathbone, who was unable to be here today since she is self-isolating, about homeless people in the centre of Cardiff. There are a number of people who are homeless in the city centre, and she's very concerned that action is taken in order to protect them at this time as well. I'm grateful.
Thank Alan Davis for those points. And can I thank him particularly for the way over the weekend he was able to supply information to me to help us with the decisions that we were making and to test those against some of the circumstances on the ground in parts of Wales. Of course, employers must abide by the rules. We saw an example earlier today of a sports company, apparently, believing that they were an essential service. I think they've been disabused of that in the meantime. But the rules are clear, and no employer should be pressurising somebody who is not a key worker to behave as though they were. I entirely agree with the point that Alan Davis made about the self-employed. It is invidious that there are some people who have the protection that the UK government has offered, and I absolutely welcome the steps that the Chancellor took last week in a wage subsidy for people who are employed but temporarily not working. We need the self-employed to have a similar sort of guarantee. Our colleague Jane Hutt is working very closely with the third sector and with social enterprises as well to learn of the issues that face that sector and to see what further help we could offer to them. I agree with what the member for Blaenau Gwent said about the importance of local government, of course. The RSG is there. Local authorities can rely on that in organising their finances. What we have done is to work with them to radically simplify the grants regime so that it's easier for local authorities to move money between different grant sources and to be less prescriptive than we would normally be about money being used for particular purposes where those purposes have been overtaken by more urgent needs. And I think the decision that this Assembly took a decade ago to sustain a council tax benefit system here in Wales will stand us in good stead. And again, it's not a permissive scheme, there's an entitlement there. If your income is of a certain sort and you meet the threshold, you will get help with council tax here in Wales. I reflect on the point that Alan Davis made about the communication challenge, and it is a challenge. and I think local broadcasters rise to that challenge pretty well most of the time. It's when you turn on a national broadcaster and hear them mangle the responsibilities as they are currently distributed across the United Kingdom that I do my best not to allow my blood pressure to rise. But sometimes they do get it so badly wrong and therefore are misleading people who hear them that it's difficult not to feel angry about it. Finally, in relation to Jenny's point, Cardiff is facing some very particular challenges in relation to its homeless population in this context. It's why we announced the £10 million early to assist them in doing that. I know the local authority have plans. They have identified new accommodation that they hope to be able to bring rapidly into use to help that population. But given the nature of the virus, the vulnerability of the population, the struggle that there can sometimes be to provide help in a way that they are able to take that help, I know our local authorities are doing their best to respond to a complex and demanding set of circumstances.
Thank you. I am going to finish this statement by 11:15, so I think I probably will get 4 more speakers in fairness to the First Minister and to those. So the people I intend to call will be Russell George, Neil McAvoy, Neil Hamilton and Hevin David. Those of you who are on the list to speak, I will do my best to put you in the top of the list on the next statement or even on the LCM. So Russell George.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll be as quick as I possibly can getting through my questions. And can I first of all say, First Minister, that I'm very happy to work very constructively with your Finance and Business and Economy Minister in a constructive way to help support the business economy of Wales. And I very much hope that your colleagues are listening in, I'm sure they are, to the issues I'm raising today, because if you aren't able to answer the questions and address them, which I understandably accept, then I hope they will be able to pick these up, perhaps in a written statement. You referred to Business Wales as being a one-stop shop last week, and I'm very pleased to hear your answer to Paul Davis earlier that 21 additional staff have now been put onto that line. Can I ask, First Minister, in terms of the website, are you absolutely certain that that is the most up-to-date information? I appreciate there will be some time lag when putting perhaps UK government information on there, but are you sure of that? Because if that's out of date in any way, then that puts pressure, of course, on the line, and AM's offices, etc. So confirmation of that would be appreciated. And can I ask also, in terms of the grants available for small businesses, £10,000 grant for businesses with a rateable value of under £12,000 and then £25,000 between 12 and 51,000 roughly. Can I ask who is administrating that and when are they administrating it and how are they administrating it? Is it local authorities? I've assumed so, but perhaps you could provide some clarity on that. Yesterday, a lot of businesses would have received business rates demands. I'm sure it would be helpful if you could put on the record that often they would have gone out before these decisions were made, and that will offer some reassurance to businesses. But there is some more detail on that, such as, for example, perhaps premises that have been empty for 6 months or 12 months. Are they going to receive that? There's perhaps some clarity around that which would be helpful. Also, in terms of business rates, the relief and in terms of the grants available, is what is detailed as perhaps a retail or leisure or hospitality business. Your Finance Minister made the statement last week. Is that including bed and breakfasts or guest houses or hotels, for example? So how can a business find out what classification they are in terms of are they a retail business? I'm sure that's available, but if details of a website could be pointed to, that would be very helpful. And currently business supports relief relate only up to property business premises with a rateable value of £51,000. I really don't think that's sufficient. I really do think that needs to be higher because there are many small businesses and family-run businesses with a rateable value of over £51,000. So perhaps you could address that issue. Perhaps the Business or Finance Minister will address that in a statement later today, but if that could be addressed. Also, in terms of what is an essential business, I'm sure all AMs across this chamber would have received emails in their inboxes asking for advice. I think businesses want to follow the government advice and they want clarity from us. So the interpretation of that, I appreciate it could be a statement that's read, but I do think there needs to be a list specifically of what an essential business is. For example, as a manufacturing business, depends on what they manufacture, construction worker working lonely or by themselves, for example. And also, can I ask if you've got any details of how the UK government scheme in terms of the retention work scheme is going to be funded? How is that going to be administrated and how is that going to come forward? Appreciate it's not in your bag entirely, but details on that would be helpful. And also in terms of advice and scrutiny of ministers, but more advice, would you be accepting for Assembly members to have telephone conversations with ministers, perhaps with civil servants in a conference call style? Because I think we do need to have advice, if not scrutiny, but advice. And also, could you consider giving perhaps telephone numbers of civil servants directly to Assembly members in this particular time to take pressure off ministers to get answers to questions that we know that are coming before us? And very finally, a related matter, Laura Ashley in my own constituency went into administration last week. Normally this would be a top headline, but clearly it's not, it's dropped down. But there are between 500 and 600 people that are employed in the Newtown and area. Clearly, many families are employed by Laura Ashley. Together, the whole family is employed. And I wonder what discussions you may have had with the company. Have you been involved, as the Welsh Government, been involved in terms of finding a buyer, and what support will be available for those staff that are affected? Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. First Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Lywydd. I'll check the point about the Business Wales website. Of course, we are doing our best to keep it up to date. It has had a huge number, thousands and thousands of views over last week, and it is one of the main ways in which we get information to people. So I'll make sure that it is, well, I'll raise it with Ken Skates, who will do that. How we get the money to firms, the administration arrangements are still being finalised. I know it's frustrating, but I have to repeat in a way the point I made last week, that while we are as keen as we can to get the money to people, in the end it is public money. And you can't simply just write people a cheque for £25,000 simply on their say-so. So you have to have some basic administration so that we can be sure that when this is over, we can account properly for the way in which the money was dispersed. Of course, Russell George is right. The business rates demands that have landed on people's mats are overtaken by events. They're no longer relevant, and people will be able to know that. I'm not certain that I have the same figures as he does about the £51,000 level in Wales and the number of businesses that are actually above that. And we are providing local authorities with some additional discretionary rate relief funding so that businesses that don't quite fit the normal rules, people who are close to the ground and understand why that business might need help, are able to make that decision. I will talk with my Cabinet colleagues, and Russell George is quite right. Cabinet colleagues will be listening to proceedings, and there's a Cabinet meeting after this session is over, so I'll take up the point about the best way for Assembly members to get advice. Finally, can I express our real sympathy for those employees of Laura Ashley. As Russell George said, in any other time, we will be spending a lot of our time talking about that. And Welsh Government is very closely involved in that situation, particularly in relation to an alternative buyer and what such a buyer might want to do with that business and how it would affect employment in Newtown in particular. So we are focused on the future and trying to make sure that where there are opportunities for that business to continue in a different form and under different arrangements, that we do our best to support that and to deliver that for the people of that part of Wales.
Thank you. Neil McAvoy.
Diolch di'r Prwy, Llywydd. Thank you for your statement, First Minister, and I hope that all your family and loved ones are well. The World Health Organization has been very clear, and they say that what we need to do is test, test, test. They say we need to test every suspected case of coronavirus because they tell us that failing to test is like trying to fight a fire blindfolded. Now, I've been sat in isolation for 2 weeks, and ultimately I was able to get a test from a private company, and it showed that I don't have coronavirus. And my dad has just had heart surgery, so my mother was extremely relieved to hear that, with the worry that I might have passed something on. Now, many families are in this situation, so I think tests should be readily available for every suspected case, particularly of key workers, and particularly of key workers whose family are showing symptoms. And as a result, NHS workers right now are in isolation because their family members cannot be tested. If we're able to test, then we can get the economy moving, keep the frontline services going, and protect people in the NHS who are very, very brave people, put themselves on the line, doing a heroic job for every one of us here. The World Health Organization say that testing is a fundamental part of fighting the pandemic because we need to know where the virus is if we're going to fight it. The testing kits can be readily available, but they're so very difficult to come across. But it doesn't have to be like that. So what action will you take to ensure that all suspected cases of coronavirus are tested? Because this is what the World Health Organization is calling for. So my first part of the contribution is, will you listen to the World Health Organization and follow advice and take action to make sure every suspected case is tested? Secondly, I want to raise the matter of people stuck abroad. I've received messages from people while sat here in Australia, that are constituents in the Gambia, that are constituents still in Peru, and there seems to be inertia on the part of the UK government. So what will the Welsh Government do? Will the Welsh Government step up to the plate and support our people who are stuck abroad? And some people are lacking medication as well. They'll need medication very shortly because they didn't plan to stay so long. So in terms of those stuck abroad, what will the Welsh Government do in the circumstances? Diolch yn fawr.
First Minister.
Thank Deputy Lywydd, and thank the member for his personal good wishes at the start, and it's very good to know that his own test proved negative and that he's able to be here this morning. On the business of testing, of course we are aware of the advice of the World Health Organization, but that advice is mediated for us by the 4 chief medical officers and by the Scientific Advisory Group, because the World Health Organization, it's a world body, its advice applies across a vast number of countries, and it has to be then interpreted in the local context. And we test that regularly with the people who advise us. They're absolutely aware of the WHO advice, and they make sure that they then give us the best advice as to how what the WHO is saying can be put to work in the local context. My colleague Vaughan Gethin will say more, I'm sure, when he's answering questions about the rapid rise in the number of tests we are going to be able to carry out here in Wales, and particularly in a point that Neil McAvoy made, how we can make sure that those people at the front line and who are out of work because they are self-isolating, how we can accelerate their return to the workplace. I'm very aware of the points the member made about people who are abroad. All of us, I'm sure, will be hearing from families in our constituencies who are in that position. My understanding is that the position in Peru has been resolved and that people are being brought home. What we do as a government is to make sure that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are alert to and know about the circumstances of Welsh citizens. We don't have a locus as a Welsh government that allows us to negotiate directly with other foreign governments. They will only deal with the member, with a state-level organisation. But we make sure that we collect information the members pass to us and then advocate on behalf of those Welsh citizens with those who have the ability to make those decisions and to make them in a way that provides the help that people who are stuck elsewhere desperately need.
Thank you. Neil Hamilton.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I commend the Welsh Government also for the constructive role which it's played in this national coalition that's been formed to cope with and ultimately defeat the coronavirus outbreak. In answer to Dawn Bowden earlier on, the First Minister encouraged people to stop buying and start eating. Can I also encourage him to put out another message, start growing? We have a massive deficit in this country in the growth of fruit and vegetables. We import a lot from abroad, which we could well grow ourselves. And in this glorious spring weather, this is the perfect opportunity for people to get their exercise, not by running outside their own areas, but actually in the garden itself. I've been digging the garden over the weekend, and I feel a lot better for it. I think this could be, in many ways, beneficial to the country, not just for its physical health, but also its spiritual health as well. And in the coming weeks, when people are stuck at home for much longer than they're normally used to, this could be a very useful way of employing themselves and avoiding some of the worst aspects of social isolation.
First Minister.
Neil Hampton makes an important point about mental health and well-being. And we are very concerned about that aspect of the advice that we're now asking people to follow, which is why people are encouraged to take exercise every day. I do have an ambition, Deepa Lywyd, to use my one opportunity for exercise to cycle to my allotment. I've been looking at my packets of seeds to see the most rapidly growing vegetables because while it's good for me and I absolutely enjoy it, I'm not going to be able to rely on that as a source of food over the weeks ahead. But the point that Neil Hamilton makes about people using the opportunities they have where they have them to do things which are therapeutic for you in that well-being sense is a point well made.
Thank you. And finally, having David.
Diolch, Deborah Llywydd. I want to thank the people of Caerphilly for the questions that they've sent me to my Facebook page, and an awful lot of the questions that they've asked have been answered, but I want to specifically focus on those that haven't. First of all, I've been asked about education settings and support for children with additional learning needs. With those children with particularly difficult learning needs that require extra support, the Education Minister's statement could have fleshed out that a bit more. So could we have some more information about support for children with additional learning needs? With regard to children of key workers, I've had a specific question from a resident who says that if both parents are key workers with children under school age, can the child be transported to a non-vulnerable relative to provide childcare, or can the relative travel to a house to support childcare with those key workers if they are unable to access a childcare setting, for example? The other question I've had is from a resident who is running a Facebook page called Caerphilly Coronavirus Support. She's been a wonderful volunteer, and Caerphilly County Borough Council have a database of volunteers who have been wanting to help those people in the community who have no support from family because they don't have family, or from neighbours because they may be isolated. Those volunteers still want to volunteer. Given that the Caerphilly Council has that database, how will they be able to volunteer, if at all? I've had questions about the trains and the fact that trains have been overcrowded yesterday. I suspect that overcrowding will reduce, but one issue is that healthcare workers to the Heath are unable to get there for 8 o'clock starts because the first trains run on the Rumney line from 8:15, and there is an issue with that. A number of people have raised a question about getting MOTs in order to keep their cars on the road, and I understand garages are entitled to stay open. Are people then entitled to use the garages to get their MOTs in order to remain mobile? And finally, I've had a question about community journalism. The Caerphilly Observer receives £24,000 from the Welsh Government's Community Journalism Fund. Hyperlocal journalism is hugely important. Can you ensure any communication revenue funding made available by Welsh Government and Public Health Wales is fairly and evenly distributed among local and relevant independent community news network hyperlocal journalists, press organisations in Wales? And can the remaining pot of money in the fund be distributed quickly now to support those journalism organisations as it is currently sitting in there and unable to be accessed?
Thank David, for those questions. I'll take up the final points about community journalism with the Minister responsible. My understanding of people needing to take cars to garages, they are able to do that. So people shouldn't be driving cars that are not safe or without MOTs. The specific question about where two people are key workers and have a child who can be looked after by somebody else, I think they are covered by the rules and allow that child to be transported to the person who will be looking after them. That's within yesterday's announcement. As to volunteers, of course we will want people to go on volunteering. One of the reasons that people are able to leave home is to help a vulnerable person, and we will be relying on volunteers, particularly for those who are needing to be shielded for many weeks, to help us with that effort. And local authorities, I think, are doing a great job in being a broker between those who need that help and people, those very generous people in large numbers who've come forward offering to help. Finally, in relation to children with additional learning needs, my colleague Kirsty Williams remains in discussions with local authorities about special schools where children have a physical illness or a physical condition that renders them vulnerable. They should stay at home. But we know that special schools and children with additional needs are not always people who are not physically compromised, and the school is often the rock around which their life is organised. And the rhythm of the school day is what gives their life a sense of order. And we are talking with our local authority colleagues of making sure that those children who need that sort of help can continue to receive it.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Thank you.